Okay, guys, bear with me. It's a long one tonight. We are going to be looking at the beginning phases of the civil rights movement. And the important thing to keep in mind about this particular time period, we've talked some about the Cold War, we've talked some about Vietnam, we've talked some about Korea. The civil rights movement, of course, overlaps with all of this. Okay, so this time period that we're looking at, like the late 40s, 50s, 60s, and even into the early 70s, all of these different things were going on in United States society and, of course, around the world. So it was an interesting time period. So the essential question for what you're looking at tonight is, how did the civil rights movement pick up speed after World War II? So we're looking at the early phases of it, the 50s and the beginning of the 60s. So separate but unequal was one of the legal terms that was used in a court case called Plessy versus Ferguson, and it kind of established how people across the United States would handle some of these newly freed slaves and the rights that they were trying to, they had been freed for about 100 years at this point, and how to handle some of the things that they were trying to do. So it's important to understand how different regions of the country felt about these issues. So in the North, there were no official segregation laws. African Americans could vote and had legal access to jobs and a variety of different colleges, but there was what people call this kind of social segregation, in that you rarely saw African Americans and white Americans mixing. So they lived in different neighborhoods. They went to different schools because they lived in those different neighborhoods. They did different things just with their particular racial group. In the South, segregation was supported by law. So this is where you see some of those dividing lines in the North and the South. Jim Crow laws is what they were called. In some areas, they were called black codes, were enforced to separate the races in public institutions like schools, hospitals, transportation, theaters, restaurants, anywhere that you might go out in public, you would have two different facilities. And there's that Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court case that ruled segregation as legal as long as the facilities were separate but equal. So the problem with this was that in the South, those separate facilities were not equal. Okay, you saw different types of schools for African American children and for white children. There was more money put into the schools for the white children and less money put into the schools for the African American children. So you start to see the development of some groups and people who wanted to fight this separate but unequal, or separate but equal doctrine. One of those is the NAACP, which was formed during the Progressive era. So this was formed in the late 1800s. And its main role was that it challenged laws that prevented African Americans from having equal rights. So it wanted to fight for African Americans to have those equal rights. You see them having these same fights in society today. Their first major victory was in 1915 when grandfather laws were declared unconstitutional. And grandfather laws were those voting laws that said if your grandfather had voted, then you had the right to vote. If your grandfather did not vote, then you did not have the right to vote. Okay, which eliminated a large chunk of African Americans from having that ability to vote. Thurgood Marshall in 1938 became the head of the NAACP, specifically the legal part of the NAACP. He used Constitution and primarily the 14th Amendment and the Constitution, which we've talked about, that Citizenship Amendment, which guarantees equal protection under the law. His ultimate goal in challenging a lot of these segregation policies with the Constitution was to end racial segregation. So we start to see some of these different areas of United States society integrate or to involve both races. One of the first areas that we saw that was in baseball and professional sports in general. So Jackie Robinson was one of the first professional African American baseball players. He was nominated Rookie of the Year. Then we started to see it in the military. Harry S. Truman, which we've talked about, was committed to civil rights, and so his main goal was, to try to improve or to try to equalize the rights of African Americans, African American citizens and white citizens. He faced a lot of challenge because he was very before his time on this, so he had to gradually implement some of these, new ideas. So his first one was to make lynching a federal crime, and then he moved down to desegregating the military. So unfortunately, one of the things that Truman faced was he had to work with legislators from all different parts of the country. He knew that the more progressive his ideas were, the less support he would have from the South. So the military was finally integrated in 1948. So African American soldiers and white soldiers had the ability to fight side by side for the first time in the Korean War, and we also saw that in the Vietnam War. So the big battle came with the desegregation of schools, which you've probably talked about in some of your classes, I would hope. The big court case, and this is one of the court cases that I want you to carry out of this class. There's not many that I want you to memorize, but it's really important to understand Brown versus Board of Education because it is what helped our school system to become what it is today. So in 1951, Oliver Brown sued the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. And it's because he wanted his daughter to have access to the white school because it was a better school, it was closer to their home. He didn't want her to have to walk miles and miles and miles every day to get to this school. So the case finally reached the Supreme Court. Thurgood Marshall was the person that ended up representing the Browns case, and he argued to end that separate but equal doctrine. The court agreed with Thurgood Marshall, and on May 7th of 1954, the justices ruled that schools should desegregate, specifically schools in the South. Few schools integrated very easily, smoothly, but schools in the South really had a difficult time with this. And a lot of those schools and the governors of the states that those schools were located looked for loopholes, looked for ways to try to avoid integrating the school system. The largest battle that happened the largest battle was in Little Rock, Arkansas. So we're going to look at the Little Rock 9 and what was going on there. So the Little Rock School Board approved a gradual plan for desegregation. Now, and this is how gradual it was. So they agreed that 9 students would go into the white Central Public High School. We're talking about 9 of many students. But the governor did not support these ideas. He did not want the schools to be integrated, so it ended up becoming this battle between the governor in Arkansas and the federal government. So the governor of Arkansas ends up calling in the National Guard to keep the students out of Central High School. But after a couple of weeks of this, President Eisenhower finally stepped in, and he sent federal troops into Arkansas to enforce the Supreme Court decision. And finally, these students were able to attend school. Now, just because they were able to attend school doesn't mean that it was easy for them, doesn't mean that they didn't have horrible things that happened to them in the process of trying to join into these school communities. So this was definitely just the beginning of what became a long struggle for a lot of these groups of people. Then the final example we're going to look at in the 50s is the Montgomery bus boycott, which started with Rosa Parks, who you all know at this point. She was an African-American seamstress. She, of course, gets on the bus in Montgomery, Alabama. She sat where she was supposed to sit, which was at the front of the bus, but was told to get up out of her seat so that somebody could sit in it as the bus became more crowded. She refused to do so, and she got arrested off of the bus. So this begins what is known as the Montgomery bus boycotts. So the news traveled very quickly in Montgomery that this is what was going on. People were upset. She was heavily involved in the NAACP and other organizations. So there was some strategy in her being the one that refused to get up. So the protest was only supposed to last for a day, but Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. gets involved with it and really makes this a fight of equal rights. He wanted there to be nobody riding the buses in Montgomery until the boycott was lifted, or until the segregation laws were lifted. And that's what ended up happening. It's important to keep in mind that 70% of the bus riders in Montgomery County were African Americans. So they were working really hard to, essentially keep the funding from going to these buses. So if they're not riding the buses, people aren't getting paid. So they wanted to, really hit people where it hurt, which is, of course, in the wallet. And finally, in November of 1956, the Supreme Court ruled that segregation on buses was unconstitutional. So this was a big step in getting rid of that separate but equal doctrine. So the next set of video notes we're going to look at is the later phases of the civil rights movement. But I do want you to keep in mind some of these early actions were some of the ones that we study the most and were some of the most efficient in the long run. See you guys tomorrow.